Ultimately, the product is not what's for lunch. The product is not what's for dinner. The product is you. The question is not what is the plastic packaged snack you're going to buy today. The question is what kind of person are you going to be? What kind of person are you going to become? What kind of difference are you aspiring to make in the world? And what are you willing to sacrifice to make that happen? In this video, I'm going to disagree with the vegan lass on the topic of production of palm oil. What palm oil and related sources of deforestation mean for vegans, ethically, politically, etc. in the year 2016. Two disclaimers. First, as I've said recently in videos, and as I may say again, the prospect of politics absolutely relies on us being able to disagree without making enemies out of each other. So obviously this is not a hate video directed towards Lauren. There's no personal conflict between us whatsoever. In terms of the drama demi-monde here, it wasn't that long ago that people were saying on the internet that Lauren and I were an item, that we were involved romantically, despite the geographic distance between us. I don't know if I could love anyone enough to move to Scotland. That would be oh my God. It's going to happen, right? Now I'm going to fall in love with somebody in Scotland and move back to Glasgow. Ugh, man, my skin crawls at the thought of moving back to Scotland. But people say it's gotten better. People say it's gotten a lot better since I used to be there. Anyway, we have to be able to talk about issues, not just issues we're relaxed about and comfortable talking about and familiar with, but exactly the issues we are most passionate about. We need to be able to talk about them without making friends into enemies, without creating undue hostility, without resorting to, gross personal insults and defamation. We have to. That's what politics requires. Politics is easy when nobody cares about the issue. It's exactly when you care passionately, when you don't have your objectivity, when you've lost track of what's an objective fact, that's when it's difficult to talk about politics. And that's what we got to talk about as vegans and otherwise. Disclaimer number 2, it's certainly peculiar for me that in engaging with this issue and with so many others, I end up kind of representing political science, where I say, look, my background in political science really gives me an advantage in understanding this issue. It's a strange irony for me because I hate political science as an academic discipline. I spend a lot of my time complaining about and lamenting that I have this diploma that's useless, it can't get me any job. Political science diploma from Canada is totally worthless. And definitely, the state of the discipline within Canada is parlous at best. It's a disaster, political science in Canada. Political science may be better in Germany or Ireland or where you're watching this video. As a discipline, like it's not that easy to generalize about from one country to the next. But definitely in Canada, it's a complete disaster. And most of what I learned in that discipline is really despite what was going on in the university, not because of what was going on in the university. So it's not like I can say to you, political science is a wonderful subject. If only more people would study political science, they'd be able to see things my way. Not true at all. I'm not encouraging any of you to major in political science. Definitely not in Canada. Okay, but look, this issue, making claims about deforestation and the effects of consuming palm oil, and then the ethical question of whether or not palm oil is vegan, whether or not vegans should basically be activists opposing the production and consumption of palm oil. These arguments rely on extrapolation. And many people, including many vegans, are uncomfortable with extrapolation as such. They feel that it's somehow a fake statistic when they're looking at extrapolation. And I saw this a great deal back when it was in vogue to discuss and debate some of the shocking claims that vegans made about the percentage of air pollution that was reduced, the percentage of land use that was improved, the percentage of water pollution that was reduced by eliminating meat agriculture. So most of those claims were about the United States. They were not about Europe. There must be similar statistical claims for Europe, but where different foundations had crunched the numbers and figured out what percentage of, for example, air pollution would be mitigated, improved, or reduced by eliminating meat agriculture and many other knock-on effects. Now, those claims relied on extrapolation. What do we mean by that? It means that you don't look at the map and simply color in the areas that are currently devoted to meat production and then delete them. You can't, replace them with a white gap as if within the United States that pollution would just cease to exist and nothing would replace it. You have to extrapolate what would the land be used for if it were not being used to produce feed for animals or, to slaughter the animals or for all the different stages of the meat industry, the leather industry, etc. So that adds up to a lot of land use, a lot of air pollution, a lot of water pollution at all the different stages of that industry. It's a lot of math. But the point is you can't just delete that number and replace it with 0 as if the meat industry and its associated stage-by-stage industries along the supply chain, as if it would be replaced by nothing, right? So, I mean, likewise, when you're looking at a particular impetus for deforestation, a particular industry or crop like palm oil, you can't say, oh, well, if this wasn't palm oil, there would just be nothing. There would be zero negative impact on the environment. It would be replaced by something. And in general, you're going to use a profile of the non-meat land uses that are likely to replace it, given the location, given the climate, and given a few other economic factors. Now, one of the clearest examples of this, back when I was a kid, there were many, I guess you could say, phony political science claims about smoking and how much money the government would save if people just stopped smoking cigarettes. So when these claims were phony is when they lacked extrapolation, right? So this is why extrapolation is so important. There used to be newspapers that would say, look, this is how much money the government spends on smoking-related deaths. So there's also smoking-related illnesses, et cetera, but just to keep this simple, let's just say deaths. Okay, so people dying of smoking-related illnesses cost the government so many millions of dollars every year. And then the newspapers would say, oh, so the government could save all this money because that would be reduced to zero if people just quit smoking. Now, it would not be reduced to zero. The point is you can't replace it with a blank. You can't replace it with a zero. You need to fill in the gap with some kind of disease profile for all the other forms of mortality that those people would experience that the government would have costs for if they were not smoking cigarettes. So, for example, people die in car accidents. People die of heart disease. Many other causes. You can't replace the cost of the smoking-related deaths with nothing. You have to come up with some abstract, some extrapolation, some set of predictions about how many people would die of how many other causes and what those costs would be to the government in contrast to the cigarette-related deaths, right? The same thing is true if you're looking at land use for growing rubber. If you were not planting rubber there, that doesn't mean that the land would become a forest preserve. It just doesn't. That's just ridiculous. It also doesn't mean that the ecological impact would be zero. With any jungle crop, with any crop in that climate, whether it's palm oil or rubber or frankly rice, you can cut down the forest and grow rice. If you say this one crop is responsible for why the forest is being cut down, you then have to come up with some kind of extrapolation for, okay, well, what if nobody was consuming palm oil? They would be farming a different kind of oil to replace it. So there's a substitute there you have to deal with. And geographically, on the map, if they were not farming palm oil in this place, what would they be farming? So where I was in Southeast Asia, there was, at that time, a lot of forest was being cut down and replaced with rubber plantations. So if we use the same line of thinking, failing to extrapolate, failing to really think about this in terms of political science, you could very easily come to the conclusion, vegans should refuse to use rubber because rubber cuts down the forest, and then once you cut down the forest, you kill the orangutans and you kill the tigers and you kill the elephants. All this horrible impact happens from deforestation, and this is being done for rubber. Now, before they were planting rubber on those places, they were planting other crops. There were other, basically, fad economic theories. People thought they would get rich from planting teak wood. There was a time when people were planting opium. I'm talking about Laos, Cambodia, etc., when they were cutting down the forest in order to farm opium. And I have read articles from people who really argued that opium farming was better for the environment than rubber farming and so on. There were, especially anthropologists, really like that kind of argument, where they argue in favor of kind of traditional subsistence lifestyles or whatever, traditional drug dealing lifestyles. There were a lot of debates around that. Is rubber actually worse than the other crops that people could be trying to make money out of? But the fundamental question here of land use is actually not going to be addressed at all by vilifying the one crop or pretending that if people did not farm that crop, they would farm nothing, or that the land would be returned to a pristine forest environment, or, even more expensive, that these governments would devote money to making habitat conservation schemes on a huge scale, like as if Malaysia is going to replace its entire palm oil industry or its entire rubber industry. Both are huge crops because same climate, etc., with enormous national park system. That's just ridiculous, right? So you have to extrapolate what land use would replace the farming of palm oil or the farming of rubber or whatever the issue is that you're choosing. So I do not believe that vegans should vilify rubber or palm oil. The other thing you have to understand is economically, for all of these countries, if you're talking about real forests, if you're talking about intact forest, then deforestation economically is an end in itself. A lot of money is made from cutting down the forest, and other projects are often pursued as a pretext for cutting down the forest. So where I was in Laos, it was completely standard for the government to write contracts, for example, for building a highway or for building a new set of power lines. It could be an underground power line, could be a power line above ground. The companies doing that would often be paid in lumber concessions. So what this means is, instead of the government of Laos paying them cash, the government would say, okay, if you build this road for us, or if you build this power line for us, we give you the right to cut down so many kilometers of forest along the route where the power line is, or along the route where the road is going to be. Now, this leads to really horrible consequences in public policy. It leads to people building roads they don't need and building roads in the wrong places, because then the company has an incentive not to build the road where it's actually useful or necessary or what have you, but to build the road where it will make them the most money and where it will destroy the most old-growth forests. Same for power lines. And I did see specific examples of that. There was one example of a power line project that was going to destroy the only wild elephant conservation habitat that they had in all of Laos at that time. I don't know if they went ahead with that project. I left before I heard the end of that story. It was like, okay, why do you think they're building the power line in exactly this place? Because it's one of the last places where the timber is really worth a lot of money. So naturally on the map, they're going to draw that line where it makes them the most money, and not where it's the easiest or most effective place to install power lines. So you have to understand, if you're talking about old-growth forest, and very often you're not, very often you're talking about clearing one crop for another. You're talking about destroying rice farms in order to plant rubber trees, because rubber trees are more profitable than rice, or it seems that way at the moment. Or you're talking about destroying tobacco plantations. All these places farm tobacco because tobacco is less and less profitable, and people think they can make more money out of palm oil. So it's very easy to misrepresent the clearance of a tobacco land for palm oil as if you're talking about cutting down old-growth forest, when you're not. And a lot of these statistics do that. In a sense, I don't blame them. They're making their argument, and anyone can read the fine print and figure out what's really going on. But if you think that today, in 2016, a country like Malaysia or Laos just has oodles of intact old-growth rainforest that's being cut down to convert from one type of crop to another, you're wrong. You're dreaming. In a country like Laos, a country like Thailand, you're already talking about 99% deforestation, where really the only old-growth forest is in protected areas, is in national parks. So the type of ecological impact or devastation of it is different. Okay, finally, I think that Lauren, toward the end of her video, the vegan lass, Lauren, she makes an argument that's implicit in the earlier part of her argument, that veganism is, in her words, quote, about doing the least harm possible. And it's not. I actually disagree with that. I recorded a couple of podcasts on this. I think 2 different podcasts that went to Patreon in response to questions I got from Jake Eames. Jake Eames has deleted his YouTube channel since then, which is a shame. He had a couple of really good videos. But Jake Eames used to ask me a lot of questions along these lines, that isn't veganism about doing as close to zero harm as possible. And Jake was worried about stuff like plastic bottles, right? Well, is it vegan? Is it ethical to be using plastic bottles that end up either being recycled or put in a landfill or whatever? I think it gets recycled. Does it really get recycled after I part ways with this bottle? Who knows? I'd like to imagine it actually gets recycled and it goes into a recycling bin, but I don't know. There is real ecological harm done by the use of plastic bottles. What's the substitute? What's the alternative? And what's the ethical decision for me to make? There is much more ecological harm done by taking airplanes. Airplane transport is one of the most ecologically harmful things you can do in your life as a human being. Is it worth it? My life is actually not about minimizing harm. My life is about making hard choices, about doing harm, about, committing to harm the environment, to harm the world, to make the world a worse place in pursuit of positive goals, in pursuit of goals that I think may be worth it. Is it worthwhile for me to take an airplane from Canada to China? Well, if it's for my own education, I think the answer is yes. If it's to actually study in a university or teach in a university or learn Chinese or learn something about the ethnic minorities here, the politics, the history, etc., obviously it could be enormously rewarding. You could be talking about, in my case, one airplane ticket in a year. It does harm the environment, but I'm doing something really that I think is meaningful and important. Hypothetical example. Do I actually believe that what I'm doing in China right now is meaningful and important? I have a somewhat sardonic attitude towards my my current educational options as the least awful of a number of options that were open to me. But I am learning a lot here in China. I'm not on vacation. It is very different ethically. Are you just taking an airplane trip for fun, or are there real outcomes? Are you pursuing a humanitarian mandate? Are you running a charity where you take a whole bunch of flights, but you're taking those flights to make the world a better place? You're using a whole lot of plastic bottles, but it's to make the world a better place. It's in pursuit of some public policy goal, some political goal that's really worthwhile. Real life is about exploiting yourself and exploiting your environment to try to accomplish something meaningful and real and important. And there are real costs, there are real impacts that sometimes you can't mitigate because there is no better substitute. I do not have a better alternative to use than plastic bottles. I don't. I don't have a better alternative to an airplane. I don't. If there was one, I'd take it. If I can take a blimp that has way less impact on the environment and takes twice as long, I'd look at that. If I could afford it, I actually do not have a substitute for the airplane. And with things like palm oil, when you look into it, are the substitutes really better? Maybe. Maybe if you live in Canada, you can make the argument that canola oil really is a morally superior substitute to palm oil. I doubt it. I think that the deforestation of Canada and the exploitation of our land to produce canola oil is probably just as problematic as what you get with palm oil. Canola oil is a type of oil we grow in Canada. Rapeseed oil, etc. I've never seen someone making these arguments about palm oil by actually extrapolating what the comparative costs and impacts would be of using instead rapeseed oil, canola oil, other types of oil. And that's exactly what you have to do for the same reasons why with the example of cigarette smoking, you have to look at the other causes of death, the other costs, and what that means for the government. You have to put it in that comparative context to make the argument that there is a better substitute available. With political science, ultimately it all comes down to war and peace. The costs and the impacts of pursuing a war are unbelievably terrible, including ecologically. If you think that governments fail to conserve power or fail to conserve fuel or gasoline when they generate electricity in peacetime, as soon as there's war involved, the loss of human life is tremendous. But believe me, the waste of, for example, gasoline is unbelievable and difficult to imagine. But if you make the decision, yes, we need to pursue this war, yes, we need to win this war for some incredibly morally important reason, then that is the commitment you're making. And so likewise, it's not about doing the least harm possible. There's no way you can pursue a war by saying, well, we're going to do the least harm possible. We're going to use the least gasoline possible. You're going to look at, the loss of human life being minimized, but all those other considerations are going to fall by the wayside, naturally. So the fundamental question is, positively, what I'm trying to accomplish, is that worth it? And then you have to look at the impacts beneath that. If you're trying to accomplish something positive in your life, then taking an airplane, using a plastic bottle, or joining the army and fighting a war, those are all the kinds of hard decisions you need to make. It doesn't mean that consumer choices are meaningless. As a vegan, I think they're tremendously meaningful. I think that, substituting tofu for beef is a tremendously meaningful, tremendously important thing for all of us to do in our lives. And that does stand up to these tests, to these issues of extrapolation, of looking at, the whole life cycle, every stage of the supply chain, what happens, etc. So there are some decisions in life that are tremendously meaningful. However, most of us are not in a position to just say, well, airplanes are bad for the environment, therefore I'm going to take a boat. I met a man who took a boat, I think he said it took more than 3 months, from Sri Lanka to Europe. Most of us don't have the option of taking a 3-month boat journey, even though I do believe if you scale it up, the ecological impact of millions of people traveling by boat instead of by airplane would be very positive, right? So what are the real substitutions you can make? What are the real moral options you have? And then you have to extrapolate for, if you take that substitute, what are the real impacts? Because even with that boat, the boat is polluting the atmosphere much less. But on the other hand, you're eating 3 meals a day on a boat for 3 months. So there's an economic and ecological impact just from the amount of time and food you're passing by taking this incredibly inefficient form of transport, even though doubtless, atmospheric emissions impact on the Earth's upper atmosphere is much, much better with boat transport than by airplane transport. But we can extrapolate. If millions of people were taking month-long boat journeys instead of airplane journeys that are only a couple of hours, what are the real impacts to the whole world, even for just all the food being consumed on all those boats, etc., etc. Life is messy. Life is full of hard choices, and that's why you need to focus on the outcomes you're pursuing. Why are you fighting the war? Why are you trying to win the war? What are the humanitarian outcomes you're pursuing? What are the educational outcomes you're pursuing? What is the type of human being you're trying to become? You need to focus on that and not focus on just minimizing harm. I sympathize with both sides on this one. But I want to state even more clearly what my conclusion is here and why I'm bothering to conclude it, why I'm bothered to explain these things to you at such great length. Ultimately, the product is not what's for lunch. The product is not what's for dinner. The product is you. The question is not what is the plastic packaged snack you're going to buy today. The question is what kind of person are you going to be? What kind of person are you going to become? What kind of difference are you aspiring to make in the world? And what are you willing to sacrifice to make that happen? In terms of time, money, effort, intelligence, suffering, sorrow, you name it. I totally sympathize with, once you get into the mentality of consumer activism, once you realize that the choices in what you buy make a big difference, that you decide being vegan is not enough, and that you're also going to try to eliminate palm oil, and you're also going to try to eliminate plastic and unnecessary packaging, and you're going to try to eliminate plane tickets. I completely understand that. I completely sympathize with that, because the people who think that way, like myself, are on a trajectory where they're trying to lead a morally good life. They're trying to make a positive difference in the world, and they're trying to mitigate or minimize the negative impacts they have in the world. I appreciate that. I sympathize with that. But I think you can fall into a trap. And this very commonly happens with people who have more of a spiritual background, who maybe approach veganism via Hinduism or via yoga mat Hinduism as it's been watered down and popularized among white Western people. It's really easy to fall into a trap where you're just thinking about personal purity, and when you're just thinking about minimizing harm. And what you need to do is take the next step and not just think, how can I use less? You have to think about, how can I have the optimal outcomes, impacts? How can I make the most positive difference? How much am I using up is a question worth asking, and I ask myself that all the time. But what use am I putting myself to? What use am I putting this plane ticket towards? What use am I putting the food I eat and the water I drink towards? Is ultimately the much more meaningful question, because it comes pretty close to the meaning of life itself. You have to be objective-oriented. You have to be goal-oriented. And once you are thinking in terms of those positive goals you're trying to accomplish, I think it puts these problems like palm oil into a very different perspective. If you want to deal with deforestation, deal with deforestation. Research deforestation. Become an activist involved in deforestation. If you want to deal with deforestation in Malaysia or Laos or Cambodia or Thailand, then that's the issue. That's what you have to tackle. That's what you have to learn about. And that's ultimately what you have to get involved with and get politically organized to make a difference about, whether you are a scientist or you work at Starbucks or you're studying language or art or architecture, whatever your situation is in life. If deforestation is the issue, then you look at your own life, you look at the toolkit you've got and how you can make a difference, right? And yeah, plastic bottles and what kind of oil your snacks are made of, those are going to become relatively trivial questions when you're on that road to actually make that positive difference. Don't start from the assumption that you're a disempowered, passive person where the only difference you can make is through the choices you make as a consumer. Even though as vegans, we tend to put those consumer choices first and foremost front and center because of the emphasis we place on, of course, eliminating meat and dairy from our lives. It's a trap. It's a trap that a lot of people don't realize they've fallen into, because you think, I want to be good, I want to make a positive difference in the world, but what you end up doing is exclusively thinking in terms of a negative difference in the world, in terms of what you eliminate from your diet, in terms of what you eliminate from your consumption habits. And instead what you need is to get positively engaged with the real issue, whatever that issue is. Whether that issue is orangutans and tigers and elephants and preserving habitat for them. Because ultimately that can only come about through a positive change, through government programs or private charity programs that actually buy the land and own and operate habitat conservation agencies so that those elephants, tigers, orangutans have a place to live. It's never going to come about through simply reducing the oil in your diet, no matter what oil that is, palm oil or otherwise. It's never going to come about by vegans deciding they can't buy rubber because rubber plantations do eliminate tiger habitat also, etc., etc. It can never come about through those merely negative changes in your life. It has to come about through positive engagement. The first thing that happens with that positive engagement is your own education. You learn how that type of agriculture works, how those types of government policies work, etc., etc. You learn how you can and can't make a difference in the world. And that positive engagement takes guts. It takes time, it takes energy, it's all on another level from simply the decisions you make every day at the corner store. And I encourage all of you to take the time, whether it's through Google, just sitting now on your living room chair, to learn more about these things if you care, to learn about where you can and can't make a difference. But at the end of the day, those are also part of the hard decisions you have to make. You can't commit to every cause. You can't make every positive difference. At some point, you have to draw the line in your life and say, okay, I'm engaged with humanitarian issues and deforestation in Laos, but not Malaysia. And for someone else, it's going to be Malaysia, but not Laos, etc., etc. So that's also in the realm of those tough decisions. You get informed, you get engaged, you get active, but then you also choose what issues you're going to remain ignorant about, you're going to remain disengaged about, and where you can't possibly make a difference. At the end of the day, you got to buy that bottled water, you got to waste that plastic, you got to burn that airplane fuel, because if you're positively engaged in the world, you don't want to do it half-assed, you don't want to do it halfway. You want to commit to achieving those goals once you've decided those goals are worthwhile and worth doing. Hypothetical scenario. Let's say 10 years from now, I'm running for Parliament in Canada for the Green Party. Green Party of Canada. It's not impossible. 10 years in the future, I can be running for Parliament. Am I going to look at that prospect, that problem, that situation in terms of how can I minimize my ecological impact? How can I have the smallest possible number of airplane flights, the smallest possible number of kilometers when I take that bus? No. I make the decision first and foremost, is this worth doing or not? If it's worth pursuing that goal, if it's worth taking the message of ecology and veganism on the road from town to town across Canada when I'm running for Parliament, then I'm going to take the largest number of airplane tickets possible. I'm going to burn through all that jet fuel. I'm going to go to Attawapiskat and Hamilton and Vancouver. I'm going to go from coast to small towns and big cities, and I'm going to go out and talk to people and say, hey, I'm running for Parliament. I really want you to hear this message. And I want your time and attention and your vote and your money. I want you to donate to me. I want you to hear me. I want you to spread this message, because this message I've got about ecology and veganism and animal rights, I think it's so important that, yes, I committed to take all these airplane tickets and burn through all this jet fuel. And I'm not doing it halfway. I'm not minimizing the input. I'm maximizing the output. I'm pursuing those real impacts because I've already decided they're worth pursuing. And if they're not worth pursuing, that's when you make that decision. Is when you say, no, this is a waste of my time, this is a waste of money, and this is a waste of jet fuel. I'm not going to run for the Green Party. And currently today, that's the decision I make. But 10 years from now, that's possible. So don't sabotage yourself. Don't sabotage your own ambitions by looking at a scenario like that and saying, oh, well, I'm going to run this whole campaign for Parliament over the internet so that I don't have to take airplane flights. I don't have to really do a campaign. No. If those objectives are worth pursuing, then they are definitely worth pursuing at that cost. And dealing with those costs and taking moral responsibility for the damage done is part of being a grown-up in the 21st century.